Today we're going to ask the question, should a record label own the masters? If you sign an artist, do you as a record label have the right to own the master recordings indefinitely? For 5 years, for 25 years, for eternity? As opposed to maybe a more modern approach of licensing the masters and then giving them back to the artist after a certain amount of time. Today we're going to look at some reasons as why you probably shouldn't own the masters, and then we'll play the devil's advocate and look at reasons why a record label would want to own the masters. But most importantly, I'm going to tell you what the average record label today is doing, what modern indie record labels are choosing to do. How do I know this? Well, I actually sent an email before recording this episode to some of my friends in the industry, some people we've had on the podcast, some big labels, some industry folks like music attorneys and advocacy organizations. And I asked them this question. I'm like, what are people doing today? What's the average? And I was pretty happy to report that we got a pretty good consensus as to what is the new norm with indie record labels. Anyway, let's discuss. There's a lot we're going to go into today. So to keep it all organized, go to otherrecordlabels.com/masters, where I'll keep the notes from today's episode so you can refer back to it. You can also listen to this episode as a podcast and see some frequently asked questions on this topic. A huge shout out to our friends at Infinite Catalog for sponsoring today's episode, but more on them in a little bit. What does it mean to own the masters? Maybe you've heard of this before. Well, the masters refers to recordings. In fact, it's usually referred to the original recordings or the master recordings. So if an artist has a song, they write that song, they go into the studio and record that song. Generally, a record label will be involved with recording that or paying for the recording and mixing and producing. And the end result, whether that's cut to vinyl or that's a WAV file or a master CD, that is owned by the record label, generally. If an artist does all of this themselves before signing to a record label, then they own the masters. Well, why would a record label feel like they're entitled to owning the masters? Generally, it's financial investment. If a record label signs an artist who has nothing, is not popular, doesn't really have any money to invest in their career, and then spends $50,000 or $100,000 or $1 million, in some cases back in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, to record and find a well-known producer and to mix and master a finished product, and then to promote it, investing all this money, then a label would say, hey, we invested all this money. We essentially created those masters. Now, this doesn't include the publishing. You see, when an artist writes a song, they own the rights to the composition of that song and the lyrics. But if a record label helps them record that song, then that instance of recording belongs to the label in a lot of cases. That's what happened with Taylor Swift, and that's why she's able to re-record her songs, because she doesn't own the original recordings, but she does own the songs themselves. So she just needs to go to a studio and re-record them. A great little loophole that I'm sure record labels are finding a way to close these days. A record label who owns the masters can then manufacture them in any way that they want or any way that the contract stipulates. They can distribute them worldwide if the contract allows. They can license some of the songs or the instrumentals for sync purposes. They can license the album to other countries to do in other formats. For example, I'm licensing one of my records right now to a retailer in Japan to do a CD version. So they're getting the WAV files and the art files to do a unique CD version that's never been done before. Because I own the masters, I can license them out to other countries. So record labels would be interested in doing that. Record labels are also interested in doing reissues and remasters at the 10-year or 20-year mark. And in some cases, a record label who gets sold or bought out or shuts down may want to sell the masters as assets to another buyer or another record label. And that's called ownership transfer. The concept of owning the masters has been really negotiated and debated a lot, especially in the last couple of years. A lot of artists feel trapped and have been given raw deals, unfair deals from record labels over the years. You've heard a lot about it with Taylor, Kanye West as well. And a lot of artists are trying to negotiate better deals. But that's hard to do when they start off as being a nobody. An artist will give away the rights to their masters in exchange for potential popularity, potential profitability, or a big fat advance in cash. Now, let's bring this back down to earth to some of us smaller indie labels who may not be dealing with $1 million production budgets or $1 million advances. How does this topic relate to us as smaller independent record labels? But first, a huge shout out to our friends at Infinite Catalog. These guys have built an incredible platform to help indie record labels manage their royalties. They take all of your income from sources like SoundCloud and Sound Exchange and CD Baby and Bandcamp and Big Cartel and Shopify, anywhere. They import all of this super specific data into your dashboard, So instantly, you and your artist can see how much everyone has made and how much everyone is owed. It's beautiful. It's super simple to use. And it's ideal for record labels of all sizes. Thanks to them for sponsoring this week's video, and make sure you check them out by going to infinitecatalog.com/other record labels, where you can get a discount code from us that you can't get anywhere else, and you can get a walkthrough on how the software works. So let's talk about why it might make sense for a record label to own the masters. Well, reason number one would be the strategic investments and trade-offs. So a record label might think that they deserve to own the masters if they literally paid for the masters to be made. And in the same way that you maybe were to invest in Facebook in the early days, let's say you gave up $10,000, which was a huge investment for you. In fact, it was your life savings. And based on how sketchy the tech world is, you were most likely going to lose that money. But then Facebook blows up, and you now own shares in the company, and that $10,000 becomes worth $10 million. Well, what happens if at the end of the 10 years or end of 20 years, your shares are now worth 10 million, but the time's up and the shares now revert back to the company? Well, that wouldn't be fair, right? And so that's the way that record labels view owning the masters. If we've invested in this artist when nobody else would, when we took a chance, when we paid real money to make the album happen, and then it blows up, we should then own that in the same way that you would own your shares in Facebook forever until you sold them. I'm not advocating for this concept or advocating for major labels or any labels who do this. If that's you, that's fine. I'm just telling you how it is and why they might view that as their right. And like I mentioned, some artists are willing to trade away these rights in exchange for something like a big advance or just that possibility of getting access to promotion and curators and distribution and things they wouldn't get on their own. Number two is the ability to kind of navigate the uncertainty of the music business. See, a record label would take a chance on lots of different artists. In fact, if you were to look at the back catalog of all of the classic albums, what are our classic albums from the decades? We're looking at albums from Nirvana or early Beastie Boys records or Marvin Gaye or Songs in the Key of Life or Thriller. These records have lived on for decades and decades. But whatever record label invested in making those records also invested in making hundreds and thousands of records that we've never heard of and that they've completely lost money on. So when a record label owns the masters, they can start to build up a back catalog of releases that helps pay for future endeavors. It helps pay for previous losses. It can allow them to be experimental. I know indie record labels, like really great indie record labels who have made a killing off of one album or one song even that funds their label for the foreseeable future, for them to take risks on weirder music or more exciting music because of this one album. This type of financial diversification is what labels want in owning the masters. It's about building a back catalog that can sustain the record label. And then finally, number three is the Kate Bush effect, or the idea of the resurging classic albums. You remember the Kate Bush song that appeared in the Stranger Things episode? Well, that was like 20, 30, 40 years after the album came out. All of a sudden, younger generations are discovering this incredible track and this incredible album and this incredible artist. She's soaring in popularity. The album re-enters the Billboard Top 200. The single re-enters the chart extremely high. And the label's making tons of money again. And so labels of all sizes really want that opportunity because it's starting to happen again, because younger people are using streaming to discover older music. A new 20-year-old is created every single day that's going to discover a classic Nirvana record. There are kids born today that are going to discover Taylor Swift in a few years' time. That means that some of these classic records can print money indefinitely, potentially forever. There's the 10-year anniversary and the 20-year anniversary albums that are being reissued. Anytime a new format comes along, like the resurgence of vinyl or whatever digital format will appear down the line, they can remanufacture those classic albums. And investors are buying up catalogs of Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan and Tom Petty because they know that those albums print money on streaming services and when they go viral on TikTok. So that's why it makes sense to own the masters forever. Again, I'm not advocating for those reasons. I'm just telling you those are the reasons why people would want to own the masters. Now, are your albums going to become the next Kate Bush or the next Thriller? I don't know. I hope so for you. But there you have it. Okay, now let's look at why a record label shouldn't own the masters. Why it doesn't make sense, in our case, for us to try to own the masters of our artists' recordings. Well, the number one reason, I believe, is because here on this channel, the ethos and the mission statement of the record labels in our community is to pioneer a new way of doing things, a fairer and more ethical way to run record labels, a more generous way. In fact, anything that the major labels do, we try to do the opposite. And I think it's creating a better record label reputation and a better record label and artist relationship. So yeah, it kind of does make sense to own the masters if an artist is cool with that. But there's a lot of kind of ethical reasons as to why we just don't want to do that. We want to do something different, even if it's not as advantageous or profitable for us as record labels. Reason number 2 is that uneasy relationship that is formed between the artist and the label. If an artist is trapped in some sort of agreement for 5 years or 10 years or 25 years or forever, no matter how good that relationship is, it's strained, it's awkward, it's stressful. To know that something that you made is ultimately owned by someone else, some artists may feel trapped in agreements. I've used this example before, but I have this agreement that's 5 years with a distributor, and they have the exclusive rights to my releases for 5 years. What's interesting is that I absolutely love this distributor. These guys have been nothing but kind and generous. I'm pretty sure they're losing money on the deal. They have totally furthered my career. I love them to death. Yet, this 5-year contract still makes me feel a little icky. I don't love the idea that I've been stuck into something. And these are people I love. These are people I'm probably going to beg to renew when this contract comes up later this year. In the first couple of years, I was like, oh man, I don't like that I have to get their approval on certain things, blah, blah, blah. I was worried, I was nervous. It turned out to be awesome. It was way better for me than it was for them, I'm pretty sure. So you can imagine even a contract where everything is super great for the artist and leans in the artist's favor, they can still feel trapped and a little bit uncomfortable because of a contract. It's normal, it's just normal. But I'm just giving you an example of like even a relationship that I absolutely adore and benefit from still gives me a little bit of that prisoned feeling. And remember, this type of tension, not in my case, but in worse cases, can really hinder any sort of future collaboration and more importantly, future creativity. And finally, one of the key reasons why a record label maybe shouldn't own the masters of their artist's recording is that they don't deserve to. If you haven't paid a lot of money to have the music recorded, in fact, if the artist recorded everything in their bedroom and then just came to you to help them with releasing it, do you deserve to own those masters forever? No. I'm going to explain to you in a second what the most appropriate model would be then. But too many labels just assume that because they're a record label, they're going to follow the major label model and that any artist that comes to them, whether they paid for the recording or not, they deserve to own the masters. Well, that's really not true. Maybe a record label will ask to license the masters for 10 or 15 or 25 years because they're paying for all the production costs. Or maybe they have access to some incredible sync licensing opportunities, or they have access to Spotify curators, and they're going to make you way more money and get you way more fans than you could ever get on your own. Maybe they're going to get you an opening tour slot with someone huge that's going to make you a star right away. In those cases, they might deserve the opportunity to have an exclusive license on the masters for a long period of time. Maybe even the rights to own the masters forever. But what about indie record labels that don't have as much to offer the artist? If they're just saying, we're going to come alongside you and advocate for you and champion for this record, and we're going to support you in every way possible, but we don't have a lot of resources. We can't give you a huge advance. We don't have deals with Spotify editors. We don't have friends at Netflix waiting to place our songs. And in those cases, a more modest licensing agreement makes more sense. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so the big conclusion, the big question is, what should you do with your record label and with your artists? Well, in the process of putting this episode together, like I mentioned, I emailed some of my close friends, a little advisory board, if you would, on this topic to find out like what is the norm, what is the common standard thing. The prevailing approach from record labels is to license, meaning you sign an agreement with the artist for a certain amount of time. Let's say it's anywhere between 2 years and 15 years. And you say that you as the record label are the exclusive distributor and representation of these masters, meaning the artist can't take those songs and also upload them to Spotify, or they can't license those songs to a retailer in Japan to make CDs. They can't maybe take those songs and get their own sync deals unless that's part of the contract. They can't make their own tapes and sell them unless that's part of the contract. So you as a record label own the masters, but only for a certain amount of time. The most common, here's the answer to the question, the most common licensing term is 5 years. I've heard some people say 2 years. I've heard some people say 10 years. So let's just plop it right there. Most people said 5 years. I think 5 years is fair. That gives a label a lot of time to work the release, and to benefit from the back catalog. If the song gets placed in a popular television show in 10, 15 years from now, the label doesn't benefit. But I think this 5-year relationship it lets the artists know that there is an end to this eventually, that they're going to regain everything. It also puts pressure on the label to work really hard in the short term. So what happens at the end of this term then? Well, commonly the contract will auto-renew unless the artist gives the label 60 to 90 days notice, saying that the artist would like to take back their masters and end the label relationship. If the artist is happy and fine, they can just keep on renewing that lease month to month, quarter to quarter, or year to year. Now, there are still cases where labels today own the masters outright. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, and I'm not saying it doesn't make sense for some artists and for some labels. That's totally up to you and up to the artists. Okay, that's all. Get the notes from today's episode at otherrecordlabels.com/masters. I hope you found this helpful, enlightening. It's kind of a dry topic, but it's a topic we got to learn from, we got to cover, we got to figure out what makes sense for us and our artists. And another shout out to my friends at Infinite Catalog. Make sure you go check them out if you need a solution for your royalties. For record labels of any sizes, go to infinitecatalog.com/otherrecordlabels. Thanks so much for watching.